You know, it's that moment when you wake up in the morning, before you even open your eyes, before you feel the air or smell the coffee, there's that little voice.
That sense of self.
Exactly. It just says, I am still me. And it's maybe the most fundamental question we have, right? Who is this me?
It's the absolute bedrock of identity because we know, we know for a fact that our bodies are in constant flux.
Right.
Every cell gets replaced. Your brain is this dynamic storm of activity. And yet, through all of that change, you have this stubborn, persistent feeling of being the same
The
person.
same owner of all your experiences from when you were a kid right up to this very second.
Precisely.
And that feeling, that certainty, it just immediately throws us into one of the oldest, deepest debates in all of human history.
It really does. It forces you to look at two completely different ways of seeing the world.
On one side, you've got the traditional view, often the religious one, that says, yes, there has to be something more.
Something immaterial. An enduring soul that's the real you.
And then on the other side, you have the modern scientific view, which is just as firm in its position. It says, no, there's no separate thing.
There is only the brain, this
Right.
incredibly complex physical organ, and everything we call the self or the I is just what that organ does.
So our mission today in this deep dive is to be your guides through that exact debate. We've looked at sources from, well, everywhere from ancient philosophy all the way to modern neuroscience.
And we're going to unpack the definitions first because that word soul is so slippery.
It's so slippery.
Yeah.
And then we'll get into the strongest arguments for its existence and then the strongest arguments against it.
Our goal here is for you to leave not just having heard a list of claims, but really understanding the intellectual weight behind them, the challenges, the implications, and how your answer to this question really does change everything.
It changes how you think about your identity, free will, morality.
And of course, death. The stakes really couldn't be any higher.
And you're right, it has to start with the language. People are constantly talking past each other on this topic because they're not even defining what they mean by soul.
You absolutely have to define your terms before you can even begin the argument.
Okay, so let's start there with a kind of definitional map. Because soul is used in at least three very different ways. And they exist on this spectrum from something almost biological to something deeply metaphysical.
The first one is probably the oldest. We can call it the life principle. In Latin, the anima.
The breath of life.
Exactly. It's that animating force, that inner energy that simply makes something alive instead of not alive.
This is a really biological, or I guess quasi-biological idea. I'm thinking of Aristotle, where plants had a kind of soul, a vegetative soul.
Right, the power to grow. And animals had a sensitive soul for movement and perception.
And then humans had the rational soul. But the point is, it's not really about personality or memory in this sense.
No, not at all. It's about vitality. When the life principle leaves, the organism dies. It's why so many ancient languages connect the words for spirit, breath, and air. They're all tied together.
So critically, this version of the soul doesn't necessarily survive death in a personal way. It's just the spark that's on, and then it's off.
It's the fuel in the engine.
Okay. Then we get to the second definition, which is probably the one we use most in, everyday life.
The deepest self, or inner core.
Yeah, the poetic one.
This is everywhere. When you hear an artist poured their soul into their work, or when we talk about being true to your authentic self.
We're all using the word soul, but we're not making a claim about a separate, spooky substance floating around inside us.
No, not at all. It's a powerful metaphor. It points to depth, passion, character, the things that make us feel unique.
It's deeply meaningful, but it's an existential claim, not a metaphysical one.
That's the perfect way to put it. You're talking about the quality of your existence, not the substance of it.
But the real intellectual battlefield, the reason we're doing this deep dive, revolves around that third really strong definition.
The immaterial self.
This is the big one.
This is the one rooted in dualism, going back to Plato, and of course famously formulated by René Descartes.
The ghost in the machine.
That's the one. The idea that the soul is a pure, non-physical substance, a spiritual entity totally separate from the body that has consciousness, reason, and will.
And crucially, it's not made of parts. You can't break it down. And it is capable of surviving the death of the body.
So for the rest of this deep dive, when we talk about the arguments for the soul, we're talking about this specific high-stakes claim. Is there really a non-material, enduring I that thinks and feels and persists, that can't just be reduced to the firing of neurons in your brain?
Because that is where the debate gets so profound. The modern scientific consensus, by and large, would answer that question with a pretty firm no.
So let's build the case for that immaterial self. Let's look at the arguments that thinkers have made for centuries, insisting that no matter how much we learn about the brain, there's still something essential that it just can't explain.
Right. And these arguments almost always start with the nature of consciousness itself. That's the place where material science seems to uh, hit a kind of wall.
The whole dualist position is built on showing that the properties of your mind, your thoughts, feeling, your sense of identity, are just fundamentally different from the properties of matter.
Matter has mass, location, you can measure it.
But a thought doesn't have a weight. A feeling doesn't have a physical location in space. They seem to be two different kinds of things.
Okay, so let's start with argument A, what we can call the inner eye and the unity of experience.
We hinted at this at the very beginning. Just think about your own awareness right now. As you're listening to us, you're seeing your surroundings, maybe you're feeling a bit hungry, you're remembering something from yesterday.
All these totally separate mental events.
And in the brain, they are separate. There are different modules for vision, for hearing, for memory, for emotion. It's a distributed, complex network.
And yet for you, the experience isn't fragmented at all. It's all instantly, effortlessly pulled together and owned by a single unified subject, by I.
And this is where the proponents of the soul really press the materialist. They ask, how can a brain, which is this complex, divisible thing made of billions of separate parts that are always changing, produce a consciousness that feels so simple, so singular, so indivisible?
You can physically cut a brain in half. People have had surgeries that do that. But
Right.
you can't have half of an eye. The inner experience of being a subject doesn't feel like it has parts.
The dualist argues that if the self were just a physical thing, it should be divisible like any other physical thing. But the inner subject, the thing that is aware of all the brain's activity, doesn't seem to be.
This brings us to a really specific concept that materialists have to wrestle with. That's qualia.
All right, qualia. It's a philosopher's term for the subjective, qualitative feel of an experience. What it is like to see the color red, or to smell coffee, or to feel sad.
A scientist can give you a perfect third-person description of seeing red, right? They can talk about wavelengths of light, retinal cells firing patterns in the visual cortex.
A complete physical story. But the dualist insists that that story, no matter how complete, leaves something absolutely crucial out.
It leaves out the redness of the red, the actual experience.
Exactly, the what it is likeness. And the argument follows. If you could have a perfect map of every physical process in the brain and still not be able to explain or predict that subjective feeling, then that subjective feeling must be non-physical.
And if the physical parts can't account for this unity and this subjective quality, then there must be something else.
There must be an indivisible, non-material soul substance. A single, unchanging anchor that owns all these different experiences and holds them together over time. That's the only way, they argue, that the 5-year-old you and the 80-year-old you can be fundamentally the same person, despite every atom in your body having changed.
Okay, so from the unity of identity, let's pivot to the question of agency. This is where it gets really intense because it's about choice and morality.
Yeah.
This is argument B, free will and moral responsibility.
Right. The soul is often brought in as the only thing that can really ground genuine free will.
And the argument starts with what's called the determinism problem.
If you're a strict materialist, you believe that every event in the universe is just the result of a prior physical cause, all following fixed physical laws.
Cause and effect all the way down.
All the way down. And that includes every single neuron firing in your brain. So if that's true, if all human action is just chemistry and physics playing out, we're basically very, very sophisticated biological robots.
And if that's the case, then real choice, the ability to have genuinely chosen to do something different, that's just an illusion.
That's the position of hard determinism. Every decision you've ever made, from what to have for breakfast to who to marry, was set in motion long before you were even aware of it.
And that just creates a huge problem for morality, doesn't it?
It completely collapses it. Our entire system of praise and blame, of law and punishment, it's all based on the idea that people could have acted differently.
If you're just a puppet of physical laws, you can't be held morally responsible for what the puppet does.
And this is where the soul comes in as the proposed seat of freedom. Because the soul, being non-physical, is argued to be outside that deterministic chain of physical cause and effect.
It's the part of you that can genuinely initiate an action, a prime mover, to borrow a term. It can make a choice that isn't just the inevitable result of prior brain states.
It allows for what philosophers call libertarian free will. The real undetermined power to choose. For a dualist, the only way to save morality and responsibility from the threat of determinism is to have a non-physical soul that can break that chain of physical causality.
Now, if you're a materialist, is your only option to salvage this compatibilism?
That's the main alternative, yes. Compatibilists try to argue that free will and determinism can coexist. They redefine free will. It's not about being able to choose outside of cause and effect, but simply being able to act on your own desires without being, say, physically forced by someone
The
else.
critics say that's just a word game.
They do. They call it soft determinism. Your actions are still ultimately determined by your brain chemistry and history. You just happen to feel free. The dualist would say that's not real freedom. Only the soul can provide that.
Okay, so we've had philosophical arguments. Now let's move into a different kind of evidence. This is argument C, near-death and mystical experiences. This is less about pure logic and more about empirical reports. Anecdotal, yes, but very powerful.
The power here comes from the consistency, the sheer number of NDE reports from all over the world, across different cultures and belief systems that share these core elements.
Right, you have people whose bodies are clinically compromised. I mean, their heart has stopped, their brain is flatlined on an EEG.
And in that state of profound physical breakdown, they report not chaos or nothingness, but a continuation of very clear, coherent consciousness.
The common themes are just astonishing. The feeling of leaving the body, what they call autoscopy.
Looking down on their own body, on the doctors working on them.
Yeah, and then moving through a tunnel, seeing a light, encountering some kind of loving presence. And the key thing, as you mentioned before, is that they often say it felt hyper-real, more real than this life.
And that's the core challenge for the materialist. If the mind is just the brain's activity, then when the brain is shutting down from lack of oxygen, consciousness should also shut down, or at least become incredibly confused and disorganized.
Instead, you get reports of heightened awareness and organized thought.
For someone who believes in the soul, this is interpreted as a direct glimpse of the soul's independence. The idea is that the brain isn't a generator of consciousness, it's more like a receiver or a filter.
And when that physical filter is damaged or switched off, the consciousness, the soul, can, for a moment, perceive reality more directly, more freely.
And you see similar themes in mystical states, not just near-death ones. People in deep meditation, for instance, report a sense of timelessness, of the ego dissolving, of a profound unity with everything.
Now, we have to address the skeptical counter-argument because it's a strong one. Isn't this just hallucination?
That is the standard scientific explanation, yes. Skeptics will point to things like hypoxia, lack of oxygen to the brain, or a flood of endorphins and other neurochemicals being released as the brain is in crisis. They argue these experiences are absolutely generated by the dying brain, not by a consciousness outside of it.
But the response to that, from the dualist side, is also quite strong, isn't it? If it's just a random chemical hallucination, why is the content so consistent across cultures?
And even more compellingly, why are there cases where NDE survivors report details from the operating room that they couldn't possibly have known, details that were later verified as accurate?
Right.
So while it's not scientific proof in a lab-controlled sense, for the person who has the experience, it often becomes their own personal, irrefutable evidence that the self is more than just the brain.
And that brings us to the final major argument for the soul, which isn't really an argument from evidence or philosophy, but from authority. Argument D, religious revelations and traditions.
Right. For most people, throughout most of human history, the soul's existence wasn't something you debated. It was a revealed truth.
You're talking about almost every major world religion.
Pretty much. The Abrahamic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, the Dharmic traditions like Hinduism and Buddhism, the concept that some essential part of you, whether you call it a soul or an Atman or something else, continues after the body dies, is foundational.
In the Abrahamic view, the soul is often seen as something directly created by God, which gives it this inherent connection to the divine, this immortality.
In a tradition like Hinduism, the Atman, the true self, is this eternal core that cycles through different lives in reincarnation, trying to achieve liberation.
The key here is the source of knowledge. It's not coming from a logical proof or an experiment.
No, the authority comes from sacred texts, from prophets, from saints, from millennia of spiritual practice and tradition. The belief in the soul isn't a standalone hypothesis. It's a core piece of a much larger, comprehensive worldview.
And that worldview provides answers to everything: where we come from, what our purpose is, and where we're going.
That's why it's so powerful and stabilizing. It offers a framework for cosmic justice, for meaning and suffering, for hope beyond death. It's an incredibly robust structure that the purely materialist view struggles to match in terms of, existential comfort.
Okay, so that's a very compelling case. You have the philosophical need for unified self, the moral need for free will, you have these powerful personal experiences, and the weight of global religious tradition.
Mm.
But now, we have to turn the tables.
Now we have to look at the case against the soul. The materialist perspective, which argues that we don't need this extra entity because the brain itself is enough to explain everything, and that in fact the evidence points overwhelmingly away from an independent soul.
And this case is built almost entirely on empirical observation, on what we've learned about the brain, especially in the last 100 years or so.
So, argument A against the soul, and this is probably the most powerful one, the extreme dependence on the brain.
It's a very simple but devastating question. If the soul is this independent, non-physical, enduring core of who you are, why is it so completely at the mercy of a squishy, fragile physical organ?
We see this over and over. You make a physical change to the brain, and you get an immediate and profound change to the self. The classic example, of course, is Phineas Gage.
The railroad worker in the 19th century who had an iron rod shoot through his head.
Miraculously, he survived. His memory was fine, his intellect was mostly intact, but his personality, his character, the very thing you might call his soul, was completely transformed. He went from being a responsible, well-liked man to being profane, impulsive, and unreliable.
The physical damage to his frontal lobe literally rewrote who he was.
And that is a huge problem for dualism.
Mm.
If your true self, your soul, is non-physical, why can't it just override the damaged hardware? Why are so-called spiritual qualities like empathy or moral judgment so clearly located in specific physical parts of the brain?
Damage that bit of cortex, and that capacity is just gone.
And it's not just physical trauma, it's chemistry.
Right.
Psychoactive drugs, hormonal changes, especially degenerative diseases like Alzheimer's.
Alzheimer's is such a powerful and tragic example of this. You see the physical brain tissue degrading with plaques and tangles, and in perfect lockstep, you see the psychological self, the memories, the personality, the recognition of loved ones just dissolving away.
If the soul were a separate, independent thing, it should be able to maintain that psychological continuity, shouldn't it? It should still be in there, intact, just unable to control the body. But all the evidence suggests the self itself is disintegrating along with the brain.
So the materialist's core question is, if the self is independent, why is it so completely and utterly vulnerable to changes in blood chemistry, physical structure, and neuron health? The dependency suggests that the self is the physical process, not just a passenger within it.
This leads directly to the next major hurdle for dualism, a problem that goes all the way back to Descartes. Argument B, the problem of interaction.
The dualist hurdle.
Exactly. If you're going to claim that reality is made of two totally different kinds of stuff, immaterial mind and material body, you have to explain how they connect. How do they talk to each other?
Right. Physical objects exist in space, they have mass, they interact with physical forces.
Mm-hmm.
An immaterial soul, by definition, has none of that.
Yeah.
So how does a non-physical thought, like I want to raise my hand, cause physical neurons to fire and muscles to contract?
Descartes guessed it might be the pineal gland, but that doesn't solve the mechanism, Cap. How does something with no physical properties apply a force to something physical? It seems to violate basic laws of physics, like the conservation of energy. It's like a ghost trying to lift a bowling ball.
And the problem works in the other direction, too. How do physical events in the brain light, hitting your retina, causing electrical signals, somehow get translated into a subjective, non-physical experience in the soul?
How does the physical state create the non-physical qualia of seeing red?
There's just no story for how that interface is supposed to work.
And critics argue that without that story, the soul isn't an explanation for consciousness. It's just adding an extra layer of mystery. You're explaining one mystery consciousness by inventing another, even bigger mystery, the soul-body interaction.
So it's this view, the soul complicates the picture instead of clarifying it.
And the final major scientific argument against the soul comes from biology and a principle of logical simplicity. This is argument C, evolutionary simplicity.
Okay, so this argument uses the evolutionary timeline as a kind of challenge.
Right. We have this vast, well-supported picture of gradual evolution. Complex brains in organisms like us evolved from much simpler brains in earlier organisms. So the dualist has to answer a very awkward question. At what exact point in that gradual process did the soul suddenly appear?
Did the first Homo sapiens get a soul, but the last pre-human ancestor didn't? That seems to impose a sharp, magical dividing line on what was actually a very slow, continuous process.
And what about other animals? Do chimpanzees have souls? Dogs? Where do you draw the line and why there? It feels completely arbitrary.
This feeds into a core scientific principle called parsimony, or Occam's razor.
Which basically says, all things being equal, the simplest explanation is usually the best. Don't multiply entities beyond necessity.
And in this case, we know that complex neural networks exist and that they're responsible for memory, emotion, and perception.
So the materialist argues, why should we invent a whole new, undetectable, non-physical substance, the whole? If the brain itself might be enough to explain the phenomena, it just seems like an unnecessary add-on.
And that's where the emergent property model comes in to replace it.
Exactly. This is the idea that mind and consciousness aren't a separate thing. They're just what happens when physical matter becomes complex enough.
The classic analogy being water. A single molecule of H0 isn't wet.
Right. Wetness is a property that emerges only when you get billions of those molecules interacting together. In the same way, a single neuron isn't conscious. But consciousness emerges from the complex interaction of billions of neurons.
And we should probably clarify here, there's a difference between weak emergence and strong emergence.
A crucial distinction. Weak emergence means the higher level property could, in theory, be completely predicted and explained by the lower level parts. Strong emergence suggests a genuinely new property appears that can't be reduced to its parts.
Most materialists are betting on weak emergence for consciousness, that one day we'll be able to map it all.
But the hard problem of qualia sometimes pushes people toward strong emergence. But either way, whether it's weak or strong, it's still an emergent property of the physical brain. The model eliminates the need to invoke a separate, non-material soul substance.
Okay, so we've laid out the two big opposing armies in this debate. The traditional dualists on one side, the hard materialists on the other. But as with most things in philosophy, the reality is a lot more nuanced.
Right. There are many views that try to find a middle ground to bridge the gap and incorporate the valid insights from both sides.
They want to accept the science of the brain without reducing a person to just a machine.
So the first of these alternative views we can call non-reductive views of the person.
This is a really influential idea now, especially in more progressive theological or philosophical circles. It completely rejects that ghost in the machine model.
The core idea here is the embodied person. It says you aren't a body plus a soul. You are a single, unified thing, a psychophysical whole. The soul isn't some separate pilot driving the body robot.
So what is it then?
In this view, the soul is the form or the organizing principle of the body.
Like the melody is the form of the music. You can't have the melody without the actual notes being played, but the melody is still more than just a list of frequencies.
That's a perfect analogy. The soul is the pattern, the function, the animating principle that makes the physical stuff of your body a living, conscious person.
And this view immediately solves some of the big problems for dualism.
It does. It solves the extreme dependence problem. Of course, your personality is affected by brain damage because the body is the necessary medium for the soul's expression. The form can't exist without the matter.
And it solves the interaction problem because there's no gap between two different substances. They're two aspects of one unified being.
So this non-reductive view lets you keep the rich language of the soul to talk about human dignity in depth, while fully embracing the scientific reality that we are physical, embodied creatures.
Okay, next we have a really radical alternative. It doesn't just try to combine body and soul, it denies that there's any permanent, unchanging thing at all. This is view 2, process and bundle theories.
This is a huge philosophical shift. It's often associated with David Hume and has very strong parallels with Buddhist philosophy.
And the core idea here is that the stable, enduring I that we feel is actually an illusion.
A very convincing illusion, but an illusion nonetheless. There is no fixed, permanent core self. Not a soul, and not even a static brain self.
So what are we?
According to Hume's bundle theory, if you look inward, all you ever find is a constantly flowing stream of perceptions, memories, feelings, and thoughts. You never find a single, stable owner of those thoughts.
So the self is just the bundle itself. It's a continuous bundle of processes in rapid succession.
Exactly. The feeling of identity and persistence we have is just the result of the continuity between those moments. It's like a flame on a candle. The flame looks like a single, stable thing, but it's actually a continuous process of wax being consumed and turned into heat and light.
So identity isn't about having a static substance. It's about the relationship between the different parts of the process over time.
Yes. And this view can still account for things like moral responsibility. The person who is punished today is connected to the person who committed the crime yesterday through an unbroken, if constantly changing, chain of psychological states. It's a completely dynamic view of the self.
Okay, and for our final alternative, we have something really mind-bending. It completely flips the script on what's fundamental. View 3, panpsychist or consciousness-first views.
Right. So materialists say matter creates mind. Dualists say matter and mind are separate. Panpsychism says, what if mind, or consciousness, is the fundamental stuff of the universe?
Panpsychism, all mind. The idea that consciousness isn't some rare thing that only popped up late in evolution in complex brains.
Instead, it's a fundamental feature of reality, just like mass or electric charge. Some primitive, basic form of proto-consciousness is baked into everything, maybe even down to the level of quarks and electrons.
Does that mean a rock is thinking?
Not thinking like we do. The idea is that individual particles have a very simple form of experience. A brain is just a system that is incredibly good at combining and integrating all that micro-level consciousness into one unified, complex, self-aware experience like the one we have.
So the brain doesn't create consciousness from dead matter. It amplifies and organizes the consciousness that's already there.
Precisely. And this model is very clever because it sidesteps the big problems of the other views. There's no interaction problem, because there aren't two different substances. And there's no hard problem of how matter creates mind, because mind was there from the beginning.
In this view, each of us is just a specific, local, complex expression of a universal consciousness. It's a way of affirming the primacy of mind without having to believe in a separate, personal, ghost-like soul.
So as we bring all these different views together, we really come back to what's driving this whole debate for most people.
Right. The deep psychological need for a guarantee.
An absolute guarantee of identity. We desperately want to know that the child in our memories is the same person as us, and that the person who faces death will also be the same.
And the traditional immaterial soul is the ultimate guarantee. It's a solid, unchanging substance that lasts forever.
But the other views ask, do we really need that strong of a guarantee? Can we have a perfectly good, meaningful sense of self without it? And they propose other ways to ground identity over time.
Okay, so the first one is just biological continuity. You are the same living organism from birth to death. The cells change, but the system, the organism, is one continuous thing.
The second, and probably the most powerful for most of us, is psychological continuity. This is the overlapping chain of memories, beliefs, personality traits, and goals. You're the same person as yesterday because you remember being them, and your character flows continuously.
And philosophers like Derek Parfit have explored this with fascinating thought experiments. If we could copy your exact psychological state to a new body, which one would be you? Most people feel the psychological connection is what matters most.
And that leads to a third criterion, which is narrative continuity. The idea that you are the main character in a single, ongoing life story. Even if your memories get fuzzy, your personality shifts, you are still the protagonist of that one biography.
It's the classic ship of Theseus problem, isn't it? If you replace every plank on the ship, is it the same ship?
It is. And the non-dualist says, yes, it is, because the functional and historical continuity is what matters. But the dualist says, no, that's too fragile.
They see memory as unreliable, biology as temporary.
Exactly. They argue that without an underlying, unchanging substance, the soul identity is just too fluid, too vulnerable.
So it really boils down to this demand for strength. How strong does your guarantee of identity need to be? If you need an absolute metaphysical anchor, the soul is the answer. If you can live with a dynamic, continuous, but ultimately physical process, then the other views are enough. So this has been a really deep and at times abstract dive into what makes us use. But now we have to land the plane. We have to talk about why this actually matters. What are the real-world stakes?
And they are immense. The view you take on this fundamentally alters your entire perspective on life.
Let's start with the biggest one. A, death.
It doesn't get any bigger. If you hold the soul view that there's an enduring non-physical self, then death is not the end, it's a transition.
The body fails, but the real you, the I, continues. To an afterlife or into a new life through reincarnation. Annihilation is off the table.
But if you hold the no-soul view, the materialist perspective, the conclusion is starkly different. Your mind is what your brain does. When the brain stops, you stop.
Death is the final, definitive end of your personal story.
And you can see how that changes everything. One view frames this life as a kind of preparation for eternity. The other says this life is all you've got, which can make every moment feel infinitely precious, but also finite.
Okay, what about B, the value of the person? How we ground human rights and dignity.
Historically, the link has been very direct. The traditional argument is that human life is sacred because humans have a soul. That divine spark is what gives us our intrinsic, ultimate value.
And the fear is, if you take that away, what's left? Are we just complex animals? Does our value get diminished?
That's the concern, yes. But a very strong secular grounding for human dignity has been developed in response.
Right. Arguing that you don't need a soul to have ultimate worth.
No. You can ground it in our observable qualities,
Oh, really?
our rationality, our capacity for deep consciousness, our self-awareness, our ability to feel profound love and profound suffering. These things, the secular humanist would argue, are more than enough to establish that every person deserves absolute respect and has inalienable rights.
So the conclusion that people have profound value is the same, but the foundation it's built on is completely different.
And that brings us to C, spiritual practice and the inner life.
Even how we approach self-improvement changes, doesn't it?
Completely. If you believe you have a soul, practices like prayer, meditation, or certain ethical rules are often aimed at purifying or awakening that soul. The work is on this non-physical core.
But if you don't believe in a soul, those practices don't just vanish, they get reframed.
They get reframed as work on your character, on your psychological habits, or even literally as work on your brain's plasticity.
So meditation isn't about connecting with your eternal self. It's about training your prefrontal cortex, reducing cortisol, and building healthier neural pathways.
Exactly. It becomes a very practical tool for optimizing the physical system of the mind. So in both worldviews, the inner life is incredibly important, but the metaphysical why behind it is totally transformed.
And just before we wrap up, we need to quickly touch on a point we made at the start, because it's so important for navigating this conversation. D, the poetic versus metaphysical claim.
Yes. It's crucial to remember that the word soul operates on two tracks.
The metaphysical claim is the big one we've been debating. Is there a literal, separate, immortal entity?
But the poetic claim is what we use every day. That music has so much soul. She is a kind soul. We're talking about depth, authenticity, character.
And the point is, you can be a complete materialist, you can fully reject the metaphysical claim, and still take the poetic or existential claim incredibly seriously.
Absolutely. You can still believe in the profound importance of living from your deepest, most authentic self. The language of the soul can be a powerful tool for talking about that human depth, even if you don't believe it points to a separate substance.
So we have covered a huge amount of ground here.
We really have. We've tried to give you, the listener, a clear map of this incredibly complex territory.
We started with that traditional dualism, the idea of the enduring non-physical self. Then we moved to hard materialism, where the mind is just what the brain does.
And then we explored those fascinating middle views, the unified embodied person, the self as a fluid bundle of processes, and even the idea that consciousness itself is fundamental to the universe.
I think any thoughtful position today has to start by just acknowledging the deep mystery here. We don't fully understand consciousness. We don't fully understand identity.
We don't. And the concept of the soul, in all its forms, stands as this powerful, persistent human attempt to give voice to that mystery, to the depth and dignity of being a person, which always seems to be more than the sum of our physical parts.
And what really matters, in the end, is maybe not which box you tick, but how the view you choose shapes the way you live.
That's it. The final question isn't a metaphysical one, it's an ethical one. It's about application. Given the profound complexity of a human being, whether that complexity comes from a soul or just from physics, how does that change how you act?
So here is our final thought for you to take away. Try asking yourself this: how do I treat myself and how do I treat others if I choose to see every single person as carrying a depth that can never be reduced to a mere object, a tool, or just an ephemeral biological process?
Whether you use the word soul or not, you can still choose to live as if your inner life matters profoundly, and as if the existence of every person around you carries a weight and a wonder that demands your respect, your care, and your awe.